Japanese automakers have picked up the slack. They now build the majority of the cars in Canada, about 77%.
Toyota and Honda, through thick and thin over the last 40 years, have never retreated from Canada.
Japan just delivered the clearest signal yet in the auto industry. The real stability in North America now sits in Canada, not in Donald Trump's United States. While U.S. automakers retreat and tariffs keep detonating across the border, Toyota and Honda are taking over Canadian auto production, expanding their footprint and demonstrating what every global CEO now understands. Canada is the reliable partner. The United States is the risk. And Japan isn't alone. South Korea has already signed a sweeping mobility contract with Ottawa, opening a new era of EV, battery, and automotive cooperation. The industrial center of gravity is shifting, and it's shifting away from the United States.
But how did Japan overtake Detroit so completely inside Canada's own auto sector? Canada's auto output has weakened over the past decade, but not because of domestic failure. The slide began when Ford, GM, and Stellantis aggressively reduced Canadian production to shield themselves from tariff cycles, regulatory whiplash, and policy uncertainty coming from Washington. A decade ago, the Detroit 3 built 56% of all vehicles in Canada. By last year, that number collapsed to 23%. Yet the story didn't end in decline, it pivoted. While the U.S. automakers pulled back, Japanese automakers surged forward, now producing approximately 77% of all vehicles built in Canada. They maintained long-term commitments, expanded capacity, and avoided the volatility that has become standard operating procedure in Trump's America. And now South Korea has stepped in as well, deepening coordination with Ottawa through a new mobility and clean tech partnership. Canada is becoming the predictable, rules-based hub for global automakers who want access to the North American market without being exposed to the U.S. political storm.
Revamping Canadian operations to make electric vehicles, the U.S. removed supports for EVs, then added steep tariffs, forcing the companies to shutter plants and lay off workers.
Let's focus on those companies, and they've shown their commitment to Canada.
At the operational level, the shift is rooted in the fundamentals. Canada's auto clusters benefit from stable, clean power, deep parts networks, and workforce continuity. Toyota's Cambridge facility and Honda's Alliston plant remain among the most efficient in the continent, producing high-volume models with consistent quality. The Japanese manufacturing philosophy thrives on predictability, and Canada provides exactly that. Detroit-based manufacturers, meanwhile, faced repeated disruptions because each tariff threat from Washington scrambled cost structures and delayed shipments. Systems engineered for just-in-time logistics were suddenly exposed to policy volatility instead of market conditions. Canada became the environment where long-term technical planning could survive. Ottawa's regulatory environment stands in sharp contrast to Washington's unpredictability. Mark Carney's government has spent its first year tightening investment incentives, accelerating clean power credits, and offering targeted support only to companies that build real domestic capacity. Trump's approach could not be more different. EV incentives cut, reinstated, then rewritten. Section 232 tariffs expanded with almost no notice. USMCA renegotiation threats hanging permanently over the sector. This created a legal climate where long-term planning in the U.S. became a gamble rather than a strategy. For global automakers, the choice is simple. Build where the rules won't change overnight. And the early signs show that Carney's stability-first model is calming the waters investors refused to navigate during the last 4 years. The economic reshaping of North America's auto chain is enormous. Canada's auto sector contributes roughly $16.8 billion USD in GDP, supporting about 125,000 manufacturing jobs and over 460,000 indirect jobs. Japanese automakers now anchor that ecosystem, contributing nearly $25 billion USD a year in economic activity. On the other side of the ledger, U.S. automakers shrinking their footprint created real financial harm. Stellantis' exit from Brampton wiped out around 3,000 jobs, a loss amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars in annual wages. GM's reductions in Ingersoll removed 500 direct jobs and an estimated 1,200 related positions, carving another 150 to 200 million USD in income out of Ontario's economy. But here is the strategic twist. Every dollar the Detroit 3 pulled out is being replaced, and in some areas exceeded, by Japan, Korea, and European investment. Volkswagen's $7 billion battery plant, Toyota increasing output, Honda preparing for EV transitions, Korea positioning itself inside Canada's supply chain rather than America's. This is no longer a patchwork response. It is the emergence of a new North American industrial model built around Canada, not the US.
This shift is not just about factories. It marks a realignment in how allies view North American stability. When the United States treats supply chains as bargaining chips, global partners hedge their bets. Japan is quietly hedging toward Canada. Korea is doing the same. This is a geopolitical repositioning driven not by ideology, but by economic pragmatism. Canada, with its critical minerals, clean energy grid, and steady diplomatic posture, has become the non-volatile entry point to the North American market. Trump's tariff-first approach has pushed Asian and European manufacturers to seek alternatives, and Canada is increasingly the preferred choice. These decisions matter. They reshape alliances not with speeches, but with factories, minerals, and multi-billion-dollar production lines.
For Mark Carney, this reshaping of the auto landscape is not an accident. It is the direct result of a strategy he articulated from day one: diversify, de-risk, and rebuild industrial strength. His government came into office under pressure after GM and Stellantis pulled back from Ontario. But instead of trying to appease Detroit, Carney doubled down on diversification, pursuing Asian partnerships, accelerating Canada's clean power transformation, and offering targeted incentives only to firms that expand domestic production. Trump unintentionally helped. His tariff cycles created the very uncertainty that pushed multinational automakers toward Canada's side of the border. And Carney's message resonates: Canada will not be a hostage to U.S. industrial volatility. This is also political ammunition. When Canadian jobs come from Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, Kia, and Volkswagen, not GM and Ford, it undermines decades of U.S. leverage in North American auto negotiations.
North America is now dividing into two auto models. The U.S. model is built on tariffs, reshoring slogans, and short political cycles. Production rises or falls depending on the president's mood. The Canadian model is built on stable regulation, clean power, critical mineral availability, and deepening ties with Japan and Korea. If the current trend continues, Canada could emerge as the EV and advanced mobility hub of North America by 2030, capturing the global manufacturers who want U.S. market access without U.S. instability. The momentum is no longer theoretical. It is already visible in investment flows, production shifts, and new supply chain mapping. The open question now is whether Europe, India, or even Southeast Asia follow the same path and place their long-term bets in Canada.
The old story no longer applies. Canada is no longer the junior partner in North America's auto game. Japan increasing production in Canada is not a coincidence. It is a referendum on where stability, talent, and predictability now live on this continent. Korea's alignment reinforces the same message. And U.S. automakers retreating has unintentionally accelerated Canada's transition from secondary player to emerging hub. This is the new reality. Canada is becoming the anchor of America's auto future, not because America failed, but because Canada adapted. And the question for Washington is now unavoidable. If global automakers are choosing Canada over the United States, how much longer can America pretend it still sets the rules of this industry?
On Friday, Chinese President Xi Jinping held back-to-back meetings with the Prime Ministers of Canada and Japan, signaling Beijing's intent to ease recent diplomatic tensions with both nations. At the meeting, Xi extended an invitation to Carney to visit China, describing it as an opportunity to continue dialogue and explore areas of mutual benefit. The Canadian leader welcomed the offer, saying it represented a chance to continue the dialogue in a constructive way.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has just achieved a quiet but remarkable diplomatic breakthrough at the 2025 APEC Summit in Gyeongju, South Korea. The gathering of world leaders was meant to discuss trade recovery and supply chain resilience, yet the real headline emerged from two back-to-back meetings: Xi Jinping's talks with Carney and Japan's Sanae Takaichi. While Donald Trump left the summit early after declaring his America First agenda fulfilled, Beijing stayed and recalibrated. Xi's calm tone stood in sharp contrast to months of tariff friction and tense diplomacy. For Canada, the moment was both symbolic and strategic. proof that a nation long overshadowed by its U.S. neighbor could carve its own path in Asia's reshaping order. Mark Carney arrived at APEC with one objective: rebuild Canada's economic flexibility. After a year of industrial losses tied to U.S. trade disputes, Ottawa needed new partners and new momentum. The meeting with Xi Jinping, though brief, validated Carney's wider Asia strategy, working with South Korea, ASEAN, and Australia to broaden Canada's network before the 2026 USMCA review. At the Jeonju session, Canada's presence stood out. It was no longer a secondary participant following Washington's lead, but a country pursuing its own balance. Diplomatic officials confirmed that discussions touched on trade coordination, clean energy cooperation, and reopening ministerial channels frozen since 2018. No headline deal emerged, yet the tone mattered: measured, respectful, and open to rebuilding trust. For Carney, tone itself was progress, the first sign that dialogue could replace defensive rhetoric. China's outreach was deliberate. After a year of slowing exports and capital outflows, Beijing began stabilizing relations with mid-sized economies. Engaging Canada helps diversify partnerships within the G7 and demonstrates to investors that China can still manage diplomacy with Western nations. It also acknowledges the limits of confrontation. Officials in Beijing framed this shift as pragmatic recovery. Rather than competing for dominance, China is courting predictability. For Canada, that shift opens practical lanes: cooperation in food safety, clean technology, and mineral supply chains that both sides need. For China, it restores a measure of credibility within APEC after years of disputes over detained citizens and export restrictions. The gesture is small, but in Asian diplomacy, small gestures often start bigger realignments. Xi's second meeting, with Japan's Sanae Takaichi, followed the same tone: cordial, brief, but deliberate. It showed Beijing testing a selective détente across the region. Japan, though closely aligned with U.S. security policy, depends heavily on stable trade with China. Both leaders discussed maritime cooperation and managing long-standing disputes in the East China Sea. Together, the two meetings reshaped the narrative of APEC 2025. They marked the first synchronized attempt by China, Canada, and Japan to moderate rivalry instead of escalate it. For Carney, this multipolar atmosphere creates opportunity. As the world splits between tariff walls and security blocks, Canada positions itself as the pragmatic bridge, small enough to talk to everyone, credible enough to be heard. By the summit's end, no joint statement changed the rules of global trade. Yet something more valuable occurred: a reset in tone and trust. The APEC images of Carney and Xi shaking hands captured a turning point for Canada's foreign policy, from a defensive stance to active diplomacy. Carney's approach shows that influence is not measured only by tariffs or GDP, but by composure and persistence. Amid U.S. volatility and Chinese recalibration, Canada found room to maneuver. If this cautious engagement continues, it could lay the groundwork for new trade corridors across Asia, defined not by ideology but by stability. The Gyeongju summit may fade from headlines, yet its meaning endures. In a world of escalating economic confrontation, Canada quietly proved that dialogue still works, and that sometimes diplomacy's smallest gestures can mark the biggest shift.